Could you imagine here in our country a decree coming out that said on April 7th of next year, all Christians, young and old, men, women, and children are to be killed on that day? Imagine the chaos and the despair and the confusion, not just felt with Christians, but with those who know and love Christians. Hi, and welcome to One Little Candle, a weekly podcast where we provide you with valuable content that will ignite your faith and empower you, believer, to make a difference in your own little corner of the world. I'm your host, Rebecca Berschwinger. In each episode, we tackle various issues that impact our faith and the world around us, like spiritual warfare and cultural issues. You'll also meet some amazing guests who stop by from time to time to share their inspiring testimonies, all with the goal of equipping you to be a shining light in a dark world, no matter how small your sphere of influence may seem, because even the smallest actions can have a profound impact. Remember, all it takes is one little candle to dispel the darkness. So what do you say? Are you ready to let your light shine?
It's the light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
Well, hello everyone, and how are you today? Thank you so much for stopping by One Little Candle. I am, of course, always very, very happy to have you here. So, in today's episode, we're going to dive into the captivating and timeless tale of the book of Esther. We're going to explore chapters 1 through 3, where we will journey to the ancient courts of Persia, which is actually modern-day Iran. But Esther is a story that is just rich with intrigue and a divine orchestration, and you can actually draw parallels with our own lives through Esther. Because through her story, we're reminded that even when the divine, God, is not overtly mentioned, because in the book of Esther, God is not mentioned at all, not even once. And, well, we know, right, as believers, that God does not have to be mentioned in order for him to exist, to be present, to be alive, and working in our lives. So, yes, God, he works behind the scenes, but he's always present. He's omnipresent. There's a couple other reasons I wanted to do a study of Esther. And the first one is that recently the Jews from around the world just finished celebrating Purim. Now, Purim is a Jewish holiday that commemorates the saving of the Jewish people from a massacre or a genocide in ancient Persia, which is now modern-day Iran, as I said. And so what they do when they celebrate Purim is the Jews exchange gifts of food and drink, they donate charity to the poor, and they gather together and eat celebratory meals and beverages. And they also dress up in costume. Now, if you were to just look at, because they have Purim parades as well. And if you were to just look at a Purim parade or something without knowing what it is, you would perhaps think that it's Halloween. But yes, they dress up in costume or in disguise, and they do this to represent the idea of Esther hiding her Jewish identity from the king. But, I've also heard it said that they do it because of Haman. Haman, who was kind of in disguise as a harmless person or a good person, when in fact he was a wicked anti-Semite. So yes, Purim, which also originated in the book of Esther, it's still celebrated to this day, but also thinking back to October 7th and the atrocities that happened there, which was, yes, that was genocide for sure against the citizens of Israel by Hamas. And we have an attempted genocide in Esther. So I thought, I think we're going to just take some time, dedicate a few episodes, and study the book of Esther. And so here we are. So a little bit of background as far as the book of Esther goes. Esther, whose real name, her Jewish Hebrew name was Hadassah, and that means myrtle. But she was given the name Esther to hide her identity upon becoming the queen of Persia. As far as the author who wrote the book of Esther, to this day, really that remains a mystery. It is suggested that possibly Mordecai, Esther's cousin, or the prophet Ezra or Nehemiah could have been the authors, but John MacArthur says that whoever the author was, they possessed a detailed knowledge of Persian customs, etiquette, the history, plus they had a familiarity with the palace at Susa. And the writer also exhibited intimate knowledge of the Hebrew calendar and their customs, and they also had a very strong sense of Jewish nationalism. So he thinks possibly it was a Persian Jew who later moved back to Israel that wrote Esther. But either way, no one really knows who the author is for sure. Well, I mean, ultimately, the author is God, because all of the Bible is inspired by God. It is the Word of God. And so, yes, God, first and foremost, wrote the book of Esther. As far as the date, when Esther took place, it occurred during the Persian period of world history, which was around 539 BC to 331 BC. But the writing, as far as the writing of the book of Esther, it was done after King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, as he's also known as, after his reign, which would have been around the mid-5th century BC. So a long time ago, that much I can tell you. But why are Mordecai and Esther Jews in Persia at the time? Well, because the Israelites, due to their disobedience, were taken over by the Babylonians and Assyrians, King Nebuchadnezzar, and they were exiled to Babylon, which was later taken over by Persia. So that is why they were there at the time. But yes, the king. So the king in the story, King Ahasuerus, that's the Hebrew transliteration of his name, but he's also known as King Xerxes, and that is what the translation that I'm going to use for this episode refers to him as. I use the NASB or the ESV, but for this, I'm going to use the New Living Translation for this Bible study. But yeah, the book of Esther, what it really teaches us to do is to trust in God's providence, even when we can't see him working, even in a country where evil may reign. And, well, we're living in one of those countries right now. But the fact is, God is still in control. God is everywhere. He's omnipresent, and he's omnipotent, and he is omniscient. He is sovereign in our lives. And throughout the book of Esther, you can see God's fingerprints all over the story, all over Esther, all over Mordecai and Haman and the king as well. But, same thing for our lives. We don't always know exactly what God is up to or the details of his plan. I mean, we can only see what we can see. But our lives are also covered with the fingerprints of God, just like Esther's. So here we go. The book of Esther, chapter 1. Now, I may not read every last verse. I may just describe some of the parts, paraphrase a little bit. But for the most part, I will be reading the verses. So here we are, Esther, chapter 1, verse 1. These events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. At the time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. The celebration lasted, get this, 180 days. That is 6 months or half a year. A tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. So right here after the first few verses, we see that King Xerxes is, I'd say, a little on the proud and arrogant side. But verse 5, when it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. So I guess at least the little guys, the nobodies, got to at least participate in it for a week. So now here we have a description of the courtyard. The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine, reflecting the king's generosity. By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. So, as we know how people can be, I'm sure it was quite the drunken revelry. It says at the same time, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of Xerxes. And on the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him, and it gives the names of the 7 eunuchs, but I'm not even going to begin to try to pronounce them. Just know there were 7 eunuchs. But anyway, he asked the eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. So he's bored now, I guess, bragging and boasting about his splendor, his majesty, his power, his kingdom. And so now he figures he'd like to show off his wife and boast about her, kind of, hey guys, look what I've got, and you don't. But she said no, and he, as it says here, was furious, and he burned with anger. Why she refused, no one knows. John MacArthur said it's been suggested that perhaps what they were expecting of her was lewd behavior in front of a bunch of drunks, or perhaps she was still pregnant with Artaxerxes, who was one of the sons of Xerxes who succeeded him on the throne. But either way, she refused, not going to do it, and the king is livid. Verse 13, he immediately consulted with his wise advisors who knew all the Persian laws and customs, for he always asked their advice. They met with the king regularly and held the highest positions in the empire. What must be done to Queen Vashti, the king demanded. What penalty does the law provide for a queen who refuses to obey the king's orders properly sent through his eunuchs? So the king is like, look, I asked her properly. I went through the eunuchs, and she refused. Who does she think she is? How dare she refuse me? Obviously, this was not a 1 Peter 3 marriage at all, by any means. So one of the nobles says to him in verse 16, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also every noble and citizen throughout your empire. Women everywhere will begin to despise their husbands when they learn that Queen Vashti has refused to appear before the king. Before this day is out, the wives of all the king's nobles throughout Persia and Media will hear what the queen did and will start treating their husbands the same way. There will be no end to their contempt and anger. Now, personally, I think these guys were really blowing this way out of proportion. But, yeah, look, Your Highness, our wives, all the women in this kingdom are going to hear about what Queen Vashti did. And they're going to follow suit. They're going to say, well, Queen Vashti didn't listen to her husband, so why should we listen to you? This was their concern. So they come up with this idea. So if it please the king, we suggest that you issue a written decree, a law of the Persians and Medes that cannot be revoked. It should order that Queen Vashti be forever banished from the presence of King Xerxes, and that the king should choose another queen more worthy than she. When this decree is published throughout the king's vast empire, husbands everywhere, whatever their rank, will receive proper respect from their wives. So it says the king and his nobles thought this made good sense, so he followed the counsel. Yeah, that sounds good to me. Yeah, absolutely. Let's get this into law as soon as possible. We need to keep these women under control, okay? So yes, they write the decree, sent letters to all parts of the empire, to each province, in its own script and its language, and it proclaimed that every man should be the ruler of his own home and should say whatever he pleases. That's exactly what it says here in the verse. He should say whatever he pleases. So, women think they have it bad today. I don't think so. Not compared to the women back then. Women didn't have a ton in the way of rights, especially in a pagan nation with a pagan king. These were not godly men, godly leaders of their homes in any way, shape, or form. So, again, women's rights. And look, I'm not into feminism. I am not a feminist. Matter of fact, I can't stand the feminist movement for the most part. I really can't. I am all for a biblical submission of Christian women to their husbands, their godly husbands who are leading their homes. But this is far from the case here. So chapter 2 begins with this. But after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began thinking about Vashti and what she had done and the decree he had made. Perhaps this is a good example of never coming out and just reacting in anger, but giving something time, right? Waiting until your emotions settle down. Something he didn't do. So his personal attendants suggested, "Let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa." And let me just talk a second here about a harem, because we hear the word a lot, but I don't know if people know exactly what it is other than, a group of women. But in a royal harem, the ruler's wives and their concubines and the female attendants and eunuchs, the eunuchs would be in charge of the harems, the women in the harems. And so it was basically where the female members of the family, it was a space reserved for the women in the home or the palace or whatever. So they wanted to bring the women into the royal harem at Susa. Haggai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem, will see that they are all given beauty treatments. After that, the young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. This advice was very appealing, it says, to the king, so he put this plan into effect. Verse 5, at the time there was a Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin and was a descendant of Kish and Shimei. His family had been among those who, with King Jehoiakim of Judah, had been exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. This man had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, were brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa and placed in Haggai's care. Haggai was very impressed with Esther and treated her kindly. So here we have God really granting Esther favor, in the eyes of Haggai, the king's eunuch. It says he quickly ordered a special menu for her and provided her with beauty treatments. He also assigned her 7 maids, specially chosen from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Esther had not told anyone of her nationality and family background because Mordecai had directed her not to do so. Every day, Mordecai would take a walk near the courtyard of the harem to find out about Esther and what was happening to her. You wonder, because you don't hear about it, so we don't know, but one can wonder, what was Esther's reaction to the news that she would have to be taken in and be made part of a harem? Was this something that she pled with Mordecai not to let happen? It was something, obviously, they didn't have any choice. So was there a lot of angst for Esther and Mordecai when she was taken? And any of the young women, really. But you wonder what her reaction was and how she was feeling, because it doesn't tell anything about that, but one could pretty much surmise. Verse 12 of chapter 2, before each young woman was taken to the king's bed, she was given the prescribed 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, followed by 6 months with special perfumes and ointments. And I'm thinking, wow, 6 months each, a whole year? That's quite the treatment. So I did what any person would do, and I Googled. I Googled this, and several sources mentioned the fact of the climate and where they were, and that in their area, because of a hot, dry desert, semi-desert area, that a lot of the times women's skin would crack or have wind damage or sunburn or things like that. But also people would have sores and skin disease. And so these oils that they used had disinfectant and antifungal properties. And so at that point, they would be noting any skin disorders and treating them to protect the king from picking up skin diseases and infections that could have been introduced into the harem, and then also just perfumes and whatnot to make her smell good. So, yeah, we women think our daily beauty routine is intensive and time-consuming. Well, not like this, thank goodness. Okay, verse 13. When it was time for her to go to the king's palace, she was given her choice of whatever clothing or jewelry she wanted to take from the harem. That evening she was taken to the king's private rooms, and the next morning she was brought to the second harem, where the king's wives lived. There she would be under the care of the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines. She would never go to the king again unless he had especially enjoyed her and requested her by name. So think about it. These poor women, okay? Again, you want to talk no very few rights. One evening with the king, all right? And so if he chooses them from however many hundreds of others there were to be his queen, then she would be his companion until she displeased him. But as for all the rest who, quote unquote, lost, they were in essence banished to the harem, where they stayed the wife or the concubine of the king. But some of them probably many of them never, ever saw him again, and maybe others rarely. And on top of that, they were not free to marry another man. All right? They essentially lived their lives as perpetual widows at that point. So, yes, much different culture than what we have today, for sure. Verse 15. Esther was the daughter of Abihail, who was Mordecai's uncle. Mordecai had adopted his younger cousin Esther. When it was Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice of Haggai, the eunuch, in charge of the harem. She asked for nothing except what he suggested, and she was admired by everyone who saw her. I have a feeling, we know Esther was beautiful on the outside, but it seems as though she just had an inner beauty as well, because I think she was a very humble and obedient woman. And again, we have God's hand in this situation too, where, as it says, she was admired by everyone who saw her. So God's hand is in play here too, just, again, granting her favor in the eyes of all those around her. So now they take Esther into King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter in the 7th year of his reign. And it says that the king loved Esther more than any of the other young women. Again, God's hand here. And that he was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. And to celebrate the occasion, he gave a great banquet in Esther's honor. He invites all the nobles and the officials, and he actually even declares a public holiday for the provinces, giving generous gifts to everyone. And it says that even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. But it says here in verse 21 that one day as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, okay, these were guards guarding his private quarters, so they're there to keep Xerxes safe from any would-be assassins. All right, they're guarding his life. But it says that they became angry at him and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then turns around, she tells the king about it, and she, of course, gives Mordecai credit for the report. They make an investigation and find out, yep, what Mordecai said was true. The guy was right. And so they impaled the 2 eunuchs on a sharpened pole, the ones that were trying to assassinate him. It says this was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Now, chapter 3. Here's where our lovely antagonist Haman comes into the picture. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier or not, but I'll say it again. I just found it interesting because I was comparing October 7th, to this story here, but we have Hamas coming up against Israel, committing genocide. Hamas, Hamas, and then we have Haman, Haman, also coming up against the Jewish people and plotting to commit genocide. But anyway, the king promotes him, so he's the most powerful official now in Xerxes' empire. Now, I want to talk about Haman's background, his genealogy here, because it says he's an Agagite. Because there's some history here between Haman and Mordecai that goes back 1,000 years. And it's not a good one. It's not a good history. So we have Mordecai, who is a Benjamite. He's a descendant of Saul. And we have Haman, an Agagite. And he was a descendant of the Amalekites. But this history between the two men goes back, as I said, almost 1,000 years when the Jews exited from Egypt. Okay? Because when they exited from Egypt, they were attacked by the Amalekites in Exodus chapter 17. The Amalekites' lineage began with Amalek. All right? Amalek was the grandson of Esau, Jacob's twin brother. So because they attacked the Israelites, the Amalekites attacked them, God pronounced a curse on them, which resulted in their total elimination as a people. And Saul, even though he received orders to kill all the Amalekites, including their king Agag, he didn't. And so because of it, Saul incurred God's displeasure, but Samuel, actually the prophet Samuel, finally hacked Agag into pieces. So Haman has his lineage from Agag, and he carried a deep hostility toward the Jews, and we'll read about it in a minute. All right, so verse 2 of chapter 3. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. So Mordecai's like, nope, I am not bowing down to this man. I have a feeling Mordecai probably was exercising discernment right there. He probably could see through Haman. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, hey, why are you disobeying the king's command? And every day it says that they spoke to him and they kept asking him. But Mordecai still, he said, nope, I am not bowing down to this man. No way, absolutely not. So, little tattletales go back to Haman to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct. And it says here, since Mordecai had told them, this is in verse 4, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. So see, the fact that he was a Jew came into play here. As Amir Sarfati has been saying since October 7th, no Jews, no news. But yeah, Mordecai is a Jew. I wonder if Haman's going to tolerate this behavior from this man. Seems as how he's a Jew. So in verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So I think there was probably a rather moderate to strong anti-Semitic attitude within Persia when you read these verses. So it says that in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence to determine the best day and month to take action. The lots were called Purim, and the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later. So then we have Haman. He approaches King Xerxes. He's going to really stir the pot here now and try to get the king all riled up. He says, there's a certain race of people scattered throughout all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Like, yeah, your highness, there's these people, those Jews, and well, they kind of keep themselves separate from the rest of us. Like they must think they're so much better than we are, but they keep themselves separate, and well, their laws are different from those of any other people. And actually, they refuse to obey your laws, King Xerxes. So it's probably not in your best interest to let them live, don't you think? Now, if it pleases the king, I think you should issue a decree that they be destroyed. And you know what? I'll give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury. Now, when I read the part, I thought, well, what do the 10,000 large sacks of silver have to do with anything, and where's that coming from? But in John MacArthur's commentary, he says that this would be money that would be plundered from the Jews when they killed them. So it sounds to me like the Jewish people were definitely thriving there in the Persian society. So it says, verse 10, the king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, the money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit. Well, little does King Xerxes know, taking bad advice once again, that he has just put the woman he claims to love and her family and her people in danger. So on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was sent to the king's highest officers, the governors of the respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving the order that all Jews, young and old, including women and children, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on a single day. This was scheduled to happen on March 7th of the next year. The property of the Jews would be given to those who killed them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all peoples so that they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa fell into confusion. So, talk about living in their own world, right? Haman and King Xerxes, kind of like our politicians do. Stuff affects everybody adversely, these laws and these things that they decree, but they're in their own little world, kind of untouched and isolated, if you will, and they continue on their merry old lives, enjoying all the benefits and the perks and basically partying. But just imagine, the city of Susa fell into confusion. Could you imagine here in our country a decree coming out that said on April 7th of next year, all Christians, young and old, men, women, and children are to be killed on that day? Imagine the chaos and the despair and the confusion, not just felt with Christians, but with those who know and love Christians, like the Jews back then. Okay, I'm sure they had plenty of non-Jewish friends. The pagan people of Persia, I'm sure had some had friendships with the Jewish people. So, confusion to say the least. Despair, really. Talk about feeling despair. The Jewish people to hear that. I mean, what would you and I as a Christian feel if an edict like that came out against us? But that's the end of chapter 3. we'll end here with that today. But can you see God's sovereignty coming into play here in so many areas and so many lives? We have a pagan king who gets rid of his queen. God grants favor to this Jewish girl named Hadassah, who becomes known as Esther, raised by her cousin Mordecai, who becomes a palace official. And they happen to both be Jewish. And we have Haman, who is the epitome of pride and arrogance and proof, living proof of the verse in Proverbs that says, pride goeth before destruction. And we have also an arrogant pagan king who nonetheless, God grants Esther much favor in the eyes of this wicked king. So it just goes to show that whether people are righteous or unrighteous, God uses people as a part of his plan, to bring his plans to fruition. And he uses them as he pleases, and rightly so. But as we'll see later, and one of the reasons I love Esther is because justice is really doled out here. And, in a world where it just seems like more and more there is less and less justice for the righteous. This story really reminds you that God is working behind the scenes, unbeknownst to us, for our own good. They couldn't see it in the story of Esther, God working behind the scenes, orchestrating all these things for their good and for his glory. But, God's always doing that. He's doing that in your life, my friend. He's doing that in my life. He's never asleep. He's always working and working on your behalf and my behalf as believers. So perhaps you may have a situation right now in your very own life that just seems hopeless and you're starting to feel despair, like you're never going to be able to overcome this, or that there's no way out. But you have to remember, we serve a God of hope who's always orchestrating things unbeknownst to us. So I want you to be that light in the darkness this week. Let your candle shine bright by trusting in God, trusting him for whatever is going on in your life, or perhaps even the life of someone you know and love. Because when people see that your circumstances are maybe seemingly terrible right now, when they see the hope that you still have and the trust in God that you have, when you're going through a dark time, well, your light is shining, okay? You're shining light into the darkness for them to see. So that's how you can be that candle in your corner of the world this week. And the same thing applies to the nation of Israel. I mean, right now, oh my goodness. Look, things worked out for God's glory. The Jewish people, we know how Esther ends. It's a happy ending. They are saved from genocide. Now, we had a terrible act of genocide committed on October 7th in Israel. And now we have Iran attacking Israel last night. And there's now going to be a war between Israel and Iran. Who knows who is going to get involved in that? But we need to really keep Israel in our prayers, because that's the same God still operating the same way as he always does, okay? God still working through the lives of powerful people and not so powerful people, ordinary people as the world would call them. Israel has hope, okay? They have hope. We always have hope in our God, so I want you to just cling to that and hold on to that. For Israel, please keep them in your prayers, and for your own life too. And let's keep Iranians in our prayers too, because I have to tell you, I was online last night with some Jewish organizations, and there are people from around the world that also were commenting and chatting and that follow as well. And I had a request from someone as I was saying I was going to be praying for Israel. And I had someone from Iran that said, very politely said, hey, while you're at it, could you please send prayers or good vibes or whatever it is, they said, for us here in Iran stuck under this regime. Could you lift us up too? And I was like, absolutely, absolutely. And, another Iranian saying, look, this is not our war. We don't want this. As a matter of fact, so many were saying, I'm from Iran and I stand for Israel. And actually, I saw a warning from the Iranian government today, warning their citizens not to put anything pro-Israel on social media. But they're caught in the middle of this. Their government is dragging these people into what's going to be a horrible war. You know, our governments, I'll tell you, when you have wicked, evil rulers, unfortunately, innocent people become victims, become the collateral damage, just like with Hamas and, you know, Palestinians. Although again, the more I see, read, and hear from Palestinians, I don't think there's too many that are not actually pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, anti-Jew. But anyway, that's a whole other, well, you can go back and listen to my episodes on Israel if you like. That's not what this is about. So I don't want to get off on a tangent either. But please come back next week. We will do chapters 4 through 7 in the book of Esther. And look, if you like this podcast, if it has blessed you in any way, please subscribe to One Little Candle. Please follow me. Subscribe to my monthly newsletter, onelittlecandlepodcast.com. There's a button there where you can subscribe. Please do. I like to send little goodies your way when I have the opportunity and keep you up to date on some things. And I take prayer requests as well. You can also email me at candlestogether@gmail.com. And of course, leave a review. Reviews are helpful. They look good, of course, as far as the platform that I'm using, but also it does my heart good to know that God has been able to use me to help someone. I just received a wonderful email a couple weeks ago, someone that listened to my Good Friday, Easter Sunday episode called Sunday is Coming. And this person was going through a really tough time. And she said, I couldn't get through your podcast without crying and blowing my nose. And she said it hit home with her. It was exactly what she needed at exactly the right time. And she was so thankful for that episode. She was thankful for my podcast. You know, she's a regular listener. And so it just did my heart good, because what a privilege to have been a part of God helping someone. And you know, that episode almost didn't happen for several reasons. I wasn't even going to do a Good Friday, Easter Sunday episode. Something kept nudging me to do it. It was last minute. I got on and I was winging it, as you would say. And I put it out there. And I went to put it out there, and there were problems with the website, with the Christian Podcast Community site. And so I'm texting the head of the Christian Podcast Community, Andrew Rappaport, to see what's going on. You know, the website crashed, and it crashed while I was uploading an episode, and now I can't upload it. It was just a whole series of problems in trying to get that episode dropped. But I didn't stop. Something just compelled me to keep going. And finally, late that night, I was able to have it post. So that almost didn't happen, but it did. God kept nudging me to just keep moving forward, and I did. So grateful after that email that I did. Anyway, all right, my friends. I hope to see you next week. Chapters 4 through 7. The story gets even more intriguing in the book of Esther. So until next time, you take care, and God bless.
It's the light of my